call this meeting to order, Monday, August 12th. Verification of meeting posted. This meeting was posted in accordance with all open meeting laws. Attendance roll call.
Tracy?
Here.
Brett?
Here.
Bob?
Here.
Terry?
Here.
Lori?
Here.
Kevin?
Here.
I'm here.
All right, thank you. If we could all stand and say the pledge of allegiance, and Kevin will lead us.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Motion to approve the agenda.
Second?
Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second. Discussion, or does anyone want to remove any item for individual consideration from the consent agenda? All right. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. All right. Superintendent's report.
All right.
Pass it up to you for the first time, me to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, super excited to be back after the first one. I was nervous after that first one, so.
I like I was in it.
We couldn't find any state champions to recognize this week, so we did our next opportunity, and we'll keep trying. We go from the state champions to seclusion and restraint information, which isn't quite as fun or exciting to transition to, but we are very excited to have Ms. Olson back with us and the great work that's happening, and the opportunity to talk about some situations that we need to look very closely at and continue to work around us living our mission in these ways. So I will transition it over to wonderful Kari Olson.
Well, thank you. So pursuant Act 118, which is the seclusion and restraint law, it's in Chapter 118 of the Wisconsin state statutes. Every year, the board should receive a report from the designee, and that's me, regarding seclusion and restraint events that occur in schools. We'll talk about what that means for us. And so you receive your report by October 1st. This information is then reported to the Department of Public Instruction by December 1st, and it's for the previous school year's data. So the definition of seclusion and restraint. Seclusion refers to involuntary confinement of a student apart from other students in a room or area from which the student is physically prevented from leaving. So that doesn't include if a child were to need a break or a timeout in a separate location. That's not seclusion. It's when a student's actually physically prevented from leaving a space to keep them safe. Physical restraint refers to restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to move freely. Their torso, arms, legs, or head, specifically outlined in Act 118, which is the new seclusion and restraint law. Prone positions are prohibited, so if a student cannot be placed on the ground face down because of the danger of that. Our staff are trained, but we do not specialize in some of the physical restraints that others, like law enforcement officers, are trained in, and so those types of holds are prohibited for school staff to engage in. So this just talks about the use of seclusion and restraint. It is really only to be used in extremely limited circumstances, and the conditions under which a seclusion or a restraint might be used is if the student's behavior presents a clear, present, and imminent risk to the physical safety of other students or staff. And again, the additional condition that needs to be considered here is whether or not it's the least restrictive intervention. So, for example, if a child was in one of our elementary buildings and left the building and was eloping, and they were headed toward the highway or an expressway, we would put that student in a protective hold because that is the least restrictive intervention feasible at the time, so that the child does not run into traffic and become injured. But if there are other things that we can do to protect that child's safety, we would engage in those processes. So for you, on an annual basis, I'm talking about the staff training. So we have, by law, we are required to have one individual trained in crisis prevention intervention in each of our buildings. We currently have approximately 175 staff in Muskego Norway School District who are trained in crisis prevention intervention. The crisis prevention intervention training is a little bit about how to safely use restraints, physical restraints, or apply seclusion in a legal and safe manner. But the preponderance of the training is really focused on de-escalation strategies, so engaging in joint regulation with the child where you're talking them through a strategy or supporting them in a manner that allows them to re-regulate themselves so that you don't need to put them in a protective hold or seclude them. So we have most of our learning strategists, which are our special education teachers and our therapists, trained. Most of our special education and instructional assistants are trained. Most of our school psychologists, social workers, and school resource officers are trained. Some of our regular education teachers are trained, some of our regular education instructional assistants. So those are like our safety aides and folks who work on the playground and during recess for supervisory duties. And then also some of our building principals. So one of the things that you're gonna hear about a little bit later is how we're gonna scale up to make sure that we have all of our staff that would be potentially in a position where they would need to help a student re-regulate and or may potentially find themselves in a position where they have to support a seclusion or restraint, making sure that they are properly trained and up to date. So the reporting requirements for Act 118, which is formerly Act 125, that was the original seclusion and restraint law. This is a revisioned law. And the reporting requirements have changed. So it is important that you are given information regarding our seclusion and restraint report, our seclusion and restraint incidences, how many, and who is involved. So is it a student with an IEP? How many students? Is it a student without an IEP? How many students? So that's the information that needs to be shared with you in addition to that same information around physical restraint. And the data must be disaggregated by school. So I'm going to start with a little bit of trend data because I think it's going to help create a picture of how seclusion and restraint has looked in our schools in the last 3 years. So back in 2021-22, that's that bottom row on this chart. And this is the chart looking at trend data for seclusion. You will see that in 21-22, we had 23 incidents in the district of seclusion. 4 of the students, there were 4 students in total that were involved in these events. So 4 students were needing to be secluded for safety reasons. And then of those 4 students, 3 of those students were kiddos with IEPs. In 22-23, we saw a pretty substantial jump. We experienced 60 seclusion events in the district. That included 7 students, and 5 of those students were students with IEPs. And then we saw a substantial reduction in the 23-24 school year, which was last school year. It went down to 9 events, and the number of students involved in that were 6 students in total, and all of those students are students that had IEPs. Our restraint data looks very similar in terms of that bump in 22-23. I'll let you just take a look at that trend data and information. We'll talk a little bit more about why things have adjusted. So this is the data that I'm required to make sure that you have access to, and this is the data that I will be reporting to the Department of Public Instruction. So at Baylane Elementary, we had a total of 4 seclusion events last school year. It involved 3 students. All of those students are students with IEPs. And at Lakeview, we had 5 seclusion events, and that was 3 students that were involved in that, and of those 3 students, all 3 students had IEPs. There were no seclusion events at any of the other buildings. The restraint events that occurred, we had 10 restraint events that occurred at Baylane. 4 students were involved in those restraint events, and of those 4 students, all of them had IEPs. There was 1 incident at Lakeview. It was a student with an IEP. And there were 13 events at Mill Valley involving 4 students. All 4 of those students are students with IEPs. So if you think back with me to that trend data that we talked about, we received notification from the Department of Public Instruction because they do monitor seclusion and restraint events in school districts. We received notification that they felt we were using seclusion and restraint as a tool perhaps more than necessary. And so what happens is the Department of Public Instruction then asks you to do a root cause analysis to determine why are we using seclusion and restraint? Are we using it appropriately? And have we appropriately trained our staff to use other tactics so that it's only being used in those situations where it's the least restrictive response feasible in the moment? And so staff did take that very seriously, and we will continue to go ahead and make sure that our staff are properly trained with crisis prevention and intervention. We're going to make sure that the district's requirement is being met in terms of the frequency of training for our staff. So we require all instructional assistants, all special education teachers, all student services personnel, and SROs to be trained in crisis prevention intervention within the first year of hire and then every 3 years thereafter. And again, that focus of that training really is around supporting the regulation of a student and de-escalation tactics, but also it empowers folks to know that if they need to seclude or restrain, they're doing it in a manner that keeps the child safe and doesn't put them in jeopardy of physical harm. So that we will be making sure that all of our staff are up to date on our training, and then in addition, we're going to provide some additional targeted training to our staff who may be engaging in joint regulation with students and helping students to regulate. So that would be like our special education teachers, student services personnel, and our special education paraprofessionals, or what we call instructional assistants. So that is where we are in our forward focus on making sure we're using seclusion and restraint in a manner that is consistent with the law, and also using other tactics to support kids for regulation. Do you have any questions? You do. Hi, Brett.
Yes, I do.
How can I help you?
So the big jump we had in 2022, 23, and last year we took a look at, I guess, the analysis to determine if we, was there anything significant that the staff took away from that? Were we restraining or secluding students more than we should have, or was there a significant change in any of the ways we analyze it and process it? I mean, I know it's one thing, it's spur of the moment, something's happening with this kid, you gotta do something. Are we changing that tactic as we look at it, or?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. What I can tell you is, I was not part of the root cause analysis.
Right.
However, it was determined that through a review of records, seclusion and restraint was used appropriately. What happened was a number of the students who were involved in those events are no longer in our district. And so that just puts that flashlight on us again to say, hey, how can we prepare our staff to ensure that they have the tools and strategies? They weren't using it inappropriately, but were there some preventative things that could have occurred prior to a student becoming so escalated that the most feasible response is the seclusion and restraint? And so that's something that we are going to be focused on going forward for this year, to make sure that our staff has some additional training around that and making sure that they're up to date on their training. But they also did, I think, spend some time, I'm sure they spent some time working on some of those regulation strategies last year, and they did take a look at making sure that that CPI training was in place and making sure people were getting more up to date. So,
Okay. But nothing significant that you saw that would have changed it during that year? Yeah, going through what we do now versus what we do then?
not necessarily, no, yeah. So I think that that's where we need to dig back in and say, let's just make sure that we have people appropriately trained for
And
regulation.
it's more important going forward because we can't change the past.
Right.
We can try, but that doesn't work out well.
Yeah. And we actually are receiving some grant-funded supports around how we can help with our students who are neurodiverse or students with disabilities in that regulation process. And Katie Berg is the statewide facilitator for some of that training through CISA 1. She is amazing. If you know who Shelley Moore is, she's an expert in the area of neurodiversity and emotional regulation. Her and Shelley Moore is in Canada, Katie Berg is the American version of Shelley Moore. So we're really fortunate to be able to access her knowledge and expertise. Excited about that.
I'm just curious what the training involves for
Yeah.
the staff.
Yeah, so it would be, we will be looking at dialectical behavioral therapy that is appropriate for school-based. So that's when.
Was it online or in person, or how did they do it?
It's a combination. We had some staff go actually just last week and participate in a 2-day training in Wanaville. So Christine Bowden graciously invited us to come over and be able to participate in that training. There is online access to DBT, the abbreviated version is DBT training. And then also it's offered through CISA, there's a 3-day. Depending upon the cost, it may be less expensive for the number of staff we'd like to see trained to bring that, the trainer into our district. So I'm gonna look at the cost benefit to having that person come in and do some training. But it's a lot of just the physiological response, helping students who are working through that like cortisol dump that their brain goes through when they're in a trauma or a crisis situation, and then making sure that we are plugging them back into the learning as soon as they're ready to, so that we're not reinforcing students leaving the classroom for extended periods of time for regulation, but making sure that we're supporting them in getting back to a healthy space and their brain is back to ready to learn before we plug them back in.
And then for us as a district, do we do any debriefing with the staff after an incident?
Yes, that's
Okay.
required by law, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that is facilitated by the principals, but I think we're gonna be tightening some of how that looks in more of a protocol for this year, so that we're making sure that that debrief touches on all the things that need to be considered and gone through as a part of the brief, so that we can be preventative in the future. It's a great question. That's probably one of my favorite changes to the seclusion and restraint law, when it went from 125 to 118, is that became required by law. And there's a lot of learning that can be done, as I'm sure you know, in the medical facilities, so, yeah.
I've got 3 questions.
Okay.
So first is, are the SROs required to adhere to the new standards?
That is a really great question. So they are included in Act 118. They were not included in Act 125. So any police officer that enters our facilities and puts a child into a seclusion or restraint process, there is a reporting that we need to provide as a school district. We will do that in collaboration with our police department to make sure that what is represented in the report is accurate. Our law enforcement officers, when they walk in, we stand down. And so when they come to use a restraint, they're trained to do things differently than we are. And while my school staff, my school personnel cannot put a student like in a prone position, our law enforcement officers are trained to do so and have the authority to do so.
Good.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
And then for the data, the student events, are those all unique or distinct, or are in some cases of the same student?
It is, so there, like, if there's a seclusion or restraint in the data that I shared with you, if it says there were like 3 students involved, those are, so there might have been 13 events. It would be 1 student per event, but it was 3 different students
Okay.
who were involved in those 13
Okay.
events, yeah.
Okay, so it could be potentially, like, on an example of 13, it could be 1, 1, and 11.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. And then, for future reporting or for anything that we get, would it be possible to get the data by position for who did the, so if it's, you said there are multiple people, it's principal, teachers, instructional aides, like, break it down by who's doing the restraining or seclusion?
That is not information that we would share publicly because there's a lot of confidential information involved in
Okay.
that. And so that's why we report based by building, but we wouldn't share publicly who's involved in those events.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one. So you said that the students, several students or 1 student, whatever, had left. So what happened? Was there a breakdown as far as the process that a student stayed that long, or like, walk us through
Yeah.
how that works.
Sure. So the students that were referenced in the prior report, I do have the ability to pull student by name, data specific to seclusion and restraint events. And we just had a couple of students move out of the district. We have had students go to an alternative setting because we're not able to support their emotional regulation needs, and it's perhaps maybe not safe. So we do have that option as a district, but we still have to count the students in alternative placement because we still are their local educational agency, so we're still their district. So we would still have to report that information to the board. So if they're in an alternative site, the alternative site would notify us.
How many times they had
Yeah.
to restrain.
And then that needs to be included in our report to the board as well as to the Department of
So it would be
Public
on, if we had someone like that, it would be on the chart, it would be listed.
Instruction. Yeah.
And I don't suppose you could separate that?
I
Well,
can.
From, so we know if we have another spike that it was at a facility
Yep.
that we contract.
And I do have to provide you that information. The data that I have from last year was students that are in our hallways. In the year prior, there were some seclusion and restraint events that occurred at an alternative placement.
It seems kind of interesting that these seclusion restraining situations are all in the elementary level and not in the higher
Yeah.
middle school and high school. Is there anything behind that?
Absolutely, I'm glad you asked. So one of the things that you'll note is that many of the students involved in these seclusion and restraint events are kids who are identified as kids with disabilities. And so they are receiving specialized instruction around emotional regulation. So as they get older, they've had more exposure to the specially designed instruction. They're learning more strategies for regulating, so that's good news. And the other piece is by the time our children hit the middle school, and you would see more seclusion at middle level if we didn't have kids who were able to regulate. But we stay away from restraint because it is not safe for our staff to restrain kids that are bigger than they are. It's not safe for the student and it's not safe for our staff. So we would engage in some other strategies, but really I think the preponderance is that kids are learning, they're just developing additional strategies. The other thing is, at the elementary, if a student were to attempt to leave the building at an elementary age, they don't have that safety awareness. And so we would be more likely to seclude them to prevent them from leaving and putting themselves in danger, again, because they don't have the safety awareness. At the middle and high school level, if a student leaves the property, we'll follow it at close range, and then we'll contact police to make sure that we're keeping them safe as they are.
So our numbers for the state do not have to include what police officers have done?
It does have to include.
It does?
If it's on school time, and it's during school hours and on school property, we do have to
You do
report.
have to, okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
That concludes the superintendent's report.
All right. Moving on to other reports. I just wanted to mention the upcoming ribbon cutting on the 28th. At, what time is it at?
5:30,
5:30?
right? Yeah.
I looked at the date and I looked at the time.
Jeremiah is shaking his head.
So hopefully everybody can be there for that. That'll be exciting. And to be able to see public come in and check out all of our stuff. And welcome Todd, since I wasn't here last month.
Absolutely.
And I have nothing else. So, board member reports. Tracy.
Yes, CISA did not meet in July, so we meet again in August, so that'll be next week sometime, Tuesday.
Thanks. Brett.
Nothing to report?
Bob?
Nothing for me.
Jason?
At a meeting tonight, summarized information that, for literacy and math, which was amazing, and some of our assessments, but nothing new other than updates. So thank you to our educational services staff.
Kevin?
Nothing.
Right, committee reports. Bob, do you want me to do yours?
Yes, please.
We continued on with the 2000s. I just helped Bob out because he's away at work. We continued reviewing 2000s. We identified some policies that we have to have our attorney review, and then a couple others that we're going to work a little further with Richard on to conclude what we need to do with those. And next month, we'll continue on our review of 2000s. And you kind of gave yours.
Yes, no board member report, just education service. Come on,
Jason.
board.
Did not meet for business services this month, but we did submit our WASB nominees by the deadline on Friday, so that's how it goes.
Thank you. Right. And on to resolution action items. Additional open enrollment seats.
Motion to approve the additional recommended open enrollment seats as presented.
So moved.
Second.
All right, any discussion? Anyone want to go over where we're at with that?
Do we have to duly post this like outside the EAC or anything like that? Like how do families know if there's open seats available? Is it just in our board docs?
Well, no, what we do is we would contact families on a wait list.
Okay,
So because the drawing happens,
Right.
Jamie in the office would then contact the next families on the wait list to let them know seats become available. I think they have a week to respond. And
okay.
if they choose not to, then they keep going on the list until they're filled.
So we have plenty of waiting list individual, okay, all right, that's what.
So you're just, it looks like you're just adding 3 5K
Correct.
to a failing. Okay, any other discussion, questions? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Gifts, grants, and bequests.
Motion to approve with thanks the following donations. Jim Whalen and Whalen Works donating $10,000 in labor and supplies to restripe Muskego High School and Lakeview parking lots. Title 1A for $89,166 to support instruction for continued academic achievement of students and overall school improvement systems. Title 2A, $51,469 to support the ongoing training and professional development of staff. And Title 4A, $10,000 to support the effective use of technology and well-rounded education of students.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. On to discussion items. June.
It's that time of year.
Yay.
Okay, so I included 2 attachments, just reviewing the preliminary budget information. Again, this is preliminary. We have a number of factors that we will be waiting for, including our third-party pupil count, which will happen the third Friday of September. October 1st is our equalization aid information that comes in from the Department of Revenue. And October 15th is our aid certification from DPI. So that gives us the final information we need to move forward with finalizing the budget. In the preliminary key budget factors document that I included, this is a document that I brought forward kind of when we're at the final stages of the budget, so I thought we'd start using this in the preliminary as well. But we are estimating a per pupil revenue limit increase of $325 per student that's in the budget. Our overall revenue limit is just about $52.2 million. We are looking at estimating our, I apologize, that Friday is spelled wrong on there. The Friday pupil count at 4,433 students. This is a decline of 50 FTE. That's kind of what we're trending toward right now based on what's an Infinite campus. So we were originally estimating 100 and we're going to do 50. Our summer school pupil count at 229. And again, we are able to include our summer school FTE count, which is the 48,600 minutes for 1 FTE, to increase our numbers for our revenue limit, giving us additional funds to support our overall school for all students. Our current October equalization aid calculation brings us to about 26.9 million in equalization aid. And this is based off of the July 1 aid estimate from DPI. There obviously could be adjustments based on what's happening in MPS, so we look forward to seeing what those will be. Preliminarily, what we have heard is it would only give us additional aid, thus lowering the tax levy. So where it affected us the opposite way last year, we anticipate if it changes anything, it will favor us on the equalization aid side, which is great for the tax levy. I included the voucher information here as well. And then the tax levy numbers, I have a separate tax levy document that will look at to do a comparison. And then our equalized valuations right now, I just have estimated at 5%. It has trended between 10 and 13% over the last 3 years. That number will simply change the impact to the taxpayer in the mill rate form. It won't change our overall levy. So we can be really conservative and have it go up. If it goes up higher than 5%, it will simply lower the mill rate for the taxpayer. We are still getting $742 per student in categorical aid, and that has continued for a number of years, but has not increased. Our total categorical aid that we receive from that account is $3.4 million, and that has decreased slightly over the years simply because we have less students that we've seen over the last couple of years. Our general fund budget is right now estimated at $63.5 million, both revenues and expenses. So as we get more information, we'll continue to update the budget, and in September, we can always make adjustments before September if we need to. If not, this is the information that we'll bring forward. And I'll prepare that really fun Excel DPI format with all the different funds so that you're able to review that in September and approve that for the preliminary information for the annual meeting. Any questions on that? Okay. The tax levy document that was included gives you our preliminary numbers. Right now, we are looking at a 1.31% increase. And again, this is just based on what DPI has put out there for the aid estimate. I did look up net new construction right now for Muskego has come in at 1.84. So the net new construction number really would take any of the increase if we were to stay at a 1.31% and absorb that, so taxpayers wouldn't see the impact, depending on where they are with their valuations. Some of them might see a little bit simply because some values go higher than others, but much different than our 8% last year. So we are in a very good spot with tax levy compared to where we were last year moving into the fall. Again, you'll see the equalized valuation at 5% there. And it shows the mill rate broken out again for 24-25. We do have the four levies. We have the general fund levy at 26.2 million, and the capital expansion is 750,000. Again, if we didn't have that capital expansion levy, that money would simply roll into the general fund, but we choose to separate it out because it helps us to not have as much of an aid impact for spending. Our referendum approved debt is 6.2 million. That's been consistent over the last couple of years and will continue at that level moving forward as we pay that down. Our community service levy, we keep at 15,000. And then the property tax chargebacks are monies that we should have received last year, but we didn't, so we had to give that back, and then we can recharge for it this year. And this year, that's $2,700. So that brings us to a total of 33.2 million. That's a 1.21% increase. Any questions on tax levy?
Is Fund 80 Fund 45 or something that we had in the past?
Fund 80 is the community service levy.
Yeah. What was it in the past?
It's always been Fund 80. We had Fund 49, which is our referendum. That's our spending fund.
Okay, that's okay.
And then the Fund 39 is where we pay the debt back.
Okay, yeah, that's what it was.
Any questions on levy?
Julie, when we're looking at what happened in MPS, not currently what's happening, but what happened a couple of years ago, are they, when they had reported incorrectly back then, is that all being adjusted now with this bigger mess?
So,
Or is it just part of it?
that's a good question.
Because we lost out on some funds then.
Yep.
Correct. So there's a couple of things that are happening. So one, I believe, is just the idea of them going to referendum, right? And so the discussion around that takes money from everybody else because they're operationally taking from the pot at a bigger level. But if we look across the state, I would say well over half the districts in the state have operational referendums that also do the same thing, just at a different level. So that's a tool that's used. And again, it's to create this equalized opportunity across the state. So that's one piece of what's happening, and that would have impacted us no matter what. And you can never prepare for that because you never know who's going for referendum and who isn't. The other piece is just their reporting. So when we all report our annual report numbers, that gives a total shared cost of what we spent versus Milwaukee versus McGuanago. And then they put those numbers into the formula to determine how much of the pie we get. And so in the past, like last year, there was that incorrect information, so MPS got more. That will now shift as they correct those numbers, and I believe will be addressed. But again, it's the same pot of money. It's not like there's that pot rolling forward. So it will be addressed for this year, but historically going back, I don't know that fixes anything for us. They do have adjustments though, at the end of the year on our revenue limit where they can, so at the end of the year, DPI, instead of everybody sending each other money for like open enrollment, they say, all right, here's how much we have left to give you in aid, here's how much you have to pay for this, here's how much you have to pay for that, and we're gonna do it all for you behind the scenes and just put it on your books. So they give us like an entry to do, and so any adjustments that need to be made at the end of the year can happen at that time. So if we're given numbers now and they need to adjust it in the spring, that can happen at that time. They have a means to do that. Because they don't give us our final aid payment until July for the previous year, so.
So you'd said that with MPS's referendum they just passed and all the others that they operate, that it affects the equalized aid?
It can, because it adjusts your total shared costs. So how much you spend as a district affects the aid formula.
Okay.
Right, so people who vote for capital referendums, that can affect your shared costs because debt is included. So like when we go out for referendum, that does impact other people.
But that should be a positive for us then if others are doing it, right? Because they're spending more and that affects them negatively on it, doesn't it?
Not for MPS, because MPS is a positive tertiary district, right? We're a negative tertiary district, so our valuations are higher. So in the equalized formula, we receive less from the state and more from our taxpayers. Well, we're kind of 50-50 right now. Because we're more property rich, and that's the whole concept of the funding formula, is the richer you are as a system, the more your community can support you and less the state should support you. So because if you're a positive tertiary district, meaning you get all 3 levels of aid, then as you spend more, you actually get more.
If you're positive,
If we spend more as a negatively tertiary, so at the 3rd level of aid, we actually get money taken away because our property values are so much higher, and that money is distributed to other poorer districts to equalize everything out, and it happens again across the state. So if we spend above what our budget is, it impacts us negatively moving forward because we get dinged on our aid as a result of spending more. So it depends on where you are in the formula. And then there's some districts that teeter, and some years they're in, some years they're out, and it just depends on the statewide average, really, is what it comes down to.
So I appreciate the levy being where it's at.
And we'll try to keep it down even further than that, if we can, again, as the numbers come in. Hopefully we see that decrease, because we would love to do defeasance if we can. We have had some, on the short-term borrowing that we did for the referendum, we had some interest accrue on that 44 million, that was like for a month. And so we have that in the fund, 39 fund balance that we can use. So we'll start to look at what makes sense to be able to do a defeasance. And if it's possible, we'll bring that forward. We'll just have to look at where we are with our fund balance in Fund 39, because we do like to keep that with a little wiggle room to give us some options for tax levies, so continue to do that.
Did you want to talk about the cash flow?
Yes, do you want to talk about
No.
that?
No, I don't.
So we've been on the border for a while. We've known that. We've known that after the pool project and we, through our referendums, we dedicated fund balance to those. Now this year, the fund balance, so the fund balance was dedicated to the band project. We have paid for the band project. So we know that those funds are going to the band project. However, through the project's interest earnings, we could then put that back and put that back into fund balance to say, well, we didn't have to use fund balance. We had enough interest to cover the cost of the project, and then that wouldn't have an impact. Unfortunately, we don't have access to interest earnings until the project closeout. So if that happens, it would be probably in spring that we would be able to do that. Right now, looking at our cash flow, our biggest need is going to be December. Because we have, in addition to the 1 million of that, we also have what's called run out from Anthem. So when you close and you change health insurance carriers, you have your costs that occur no matter what. But that company, because they're not continuing, is then forced to not take their time with how they're processing claims, and they squeeze it all into the last end of the year. And so we anticipate about another 1 million between October and November coming through, in addition to our normal healthcare costs. So that's creating that as well. And then just, escalation of costs is just another factor that we see. Because we're a school district, we spend a lot of our money to get up and running in the summer. And so cash flow just presents issues when you have higher rising costs and all of that happening before you get your very small amount of aid in December, and then we get our big amount in January. So this is, I'm looking at different options because a normal borrowing for schools can be for a year. So you're accruing interest and then you're paying back with interest. There are also some other things. We could look at banks' line of credit. We need it for a month and a half. Can we pay it back after that? And then it's really just for a month that we need it, and then we're done with it. Is there a benefit to borrowing? Because we could actually make money off of the money that we borrow when we don't need it before we pay it back. And there's we are seeing higher rates right now. We've seen that with our referendum project, higher rates than we anticipated. So I'm looking at different banks and different options that I will bring back in September as we look forward. The question did come up, well, can't we just cut the budget to not have to borrow? And while that, there's a couple of things that impact that. So one, 75% of our budget is staffing. And so everybody has contracts, so that makes it difficult to do. But also, $1 million doesn't occur in that, like the particular month. So like if we were to cut health insurance costs per se, or if we were to cut construction, Jeremiah's budget, essentially that's $750,000. We're not doing that, but I'm just saying if we did, that wouldn't all occur in fall. That would be spread out throughout the year. And so even if we did make that cut, it still wouldn't help us for just that 1 month that we need those funds. And we're hoping that because these are some big one-time things, that next year we're not in the same situation, because we are right on the border and we'll continue to work to not be in this situation, but we know where we're at.
What is the anticipated for the interest that we would get back, do you think, on that?
It was originally estimated at 1.6 million. So we know we did some parking lot work, and really the balance of that could be used to put back into fund balance. I anticipate, I haven't got an updated report from them, but it's probably more, just given that our payment schedule has been pushed a little bit, so we have been able to reinvest some of our funds to see
What's
more.
what is it at right now, and what's our comfort level that works?
Fund balance?
Yeah, like, what is the magic number that's always worked for us?
Well, it depends on our costs, right? So as our operating budget goes up, that same number has to continue to rise, and we haven't seen fund balance rise with the way that our budget has rose.
Well, I feel like we've been picking out of it a
We have
lot.
been. Mm-hmm. And I'll bring back that analysis, you can actually see that
Yeah.
when we move forward and see what that number is.
Do you think the enrollment might have affected us a little bit?
For sure, yeah, because we're getting, yeah.
Yeah.
It does. It does. You get less money. Costs are increasing. We're having this weird, and the reason it's impacting us so much enrollment-wise this year is because we're on our 3rd year of decline. So where every year you have declining enrollment, you have this exemption that kicks in, so you're feeling the rolling average of 3 years. So we finally hit that year where we're no longer increasing. In 2020, we increased, during COVID, we increased like 82 FTE. And then we lost that next year. And so we had that number sitting on as an increased FTE at 11,000 per student. That was significant. As we lost that, okay, now we get a third of that. The next year, okay, now we're feeling a third of it, and now the third year, we're only feeling the decline of those 200 students. So we are starting to feel that impact for sure. And so as we move forward and we look at budget moving into 25, 26, we just have to be real aware of where enrollment is at and really work hard on our zero-based budget process to make sure that we're looking closely at everything and making sure that we're using funds where they need to be and cutting where we don't need the funds.
Bob, do you have anything? Bob?
I do not.
Okay.
I've got
Go
some.
ahead.
So you said you are working on a plan to
Yes.
try and prevent that going forward. It's something we always try to avoid, but
Try to strive for it, yes.
we know with all the stuff we've done over the last several years with the swimming pool, the parking lot, the band rooms, all this stuff, which is a huge benefit to the district. I think we all feel that way.
Well, and I think.
It just kind of accumulated, and that's fine, but I'd like to see the plan that we'll come up with, how we'll be able to get past that over the next couple of years and kind of rebuild that buffer that we've always had.
For sure.
And I know some of the community kind of appreciate that we've been doing a lot of that out of the excess fund balance we had, but now it has caught up to us a bit. Not in a disastrous way, but
No.
I just want to make sure that going forward, we'll be able to operate the way we have been. Thank you.
Maybe he'll be a baby boomer. Fingers crossed.
Not with this generation.
Does that go in the parent newsletter?
Want more kids.
Any other questions for Julie? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. On to number 7, information follow-up. You will find your extra financials there, your personnel information memo, and any other communication and business authorized by law. And on to number 8, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned.